Welcome back. Well, we've looked at liberalism, as I've called it, that basically developed during the 17th and 18th centuries, led to the Enlightenment, historical criticism of the Bible, and a little bit on the ideas of a separate religion from Christianity, really called deism. And in the last lecture, we spent some time looking at liberal theology, principally through two of the great 19th century liberal theologians or fathers of liberal theology, Friedrich Schleiermacher and Albert Ritschl. And now we want to look at some evangelical reactions to the rise of liberalism and liberal theology in this particular lecture. And we're going to take basically a look at two of these reactions, a more popular reaction with Charles Spurgeon, and then backing up even a little bit further than that, we're going to be looking at the reaction of Princeton Seminary, or what we should more clearly identify as Old Princeton Seminary. So let me get to write that. Two reactions to this liberalism and liberal theology that we've been looking at. Since this is a course in historical theology, I'm only going to briefly mention the popular response, which was basically evangelicals just kept preaching the gospel. They just kept preaching scripture. They just kept preaching. And the preeminent example of that was Charles Spurgeon, Charles Haddon Spurgeon. Spurgeon is a name that I'm sure you all know well. He was known for his compelling, consistent, and Calvinistic preaching. He was also involved in what came to be known as the downgrade controversy, which, for the purposes of this class in historical theology, I guess is the most interesting aspect of his very wide and popular ministry. The downgrade controversy was about doctrinal matters that went to the very heart of Christian orthodoxy. Charles Spurgeon had a publication entitled The Sword and Trowel, which went out to quite a few evangelicals, not only in the United Kingdom, but also in the United States and elsewhere. And at one point, he had an article written. He didn't write the original article, but he had an article written that used the phrase, the downgrade, the church is on the downgrade. And what that meant was the church was succumbing to liberal theology, which he likened, the article likened to a cart on the downgrade on a hill, that if allowed to keep rolling, it's just going to keep gaining speed on the downgrade, and very difficult to turn things around. Well, that's the metaphor, the downgrade. And he, in that publication, this author saw the church as, in England anyway, as on that downgrade. Well, Spurgeon picked that up, and in a number of other articles that he wrote and commented on in the Sword and the Trowel, that was eventually sort of picked up as the title of this particular controversy, and is now, you can buy that as a separate publication, even as you can see there on the slide, as the original account of the downgrade controversy. In any case, this is what Spurgeon saw was happening within the evangelical church, and especially within the Baptist Union, of which he was a part. In this famous controversy, Spurgeon had four main grievances with the men of his own denomination, the Baptist Union. But again, this would be true of evangelicalism in general, as he saw it. He summarized these in these articles that, basically summarized in what's called the downgrade controversy. Spurgeon said this: "We cannot hold the inspiration of the Bible and yet reject it. We cannot believe in the atonement, that is the substitutionary sacrifice of Christ on the cross, and yet deny it. We cannot recognize the punishment of the impenitent and yet indulge a larger hope, that is, believe in hell and yet deny it. One way or another, we must go. Decision is the virtue of the hour." You can see that those things that Spurgeon is indicating that rejection of the Bible, rejection of the atonement, by the way, also rejection of the miracles of Christ, virgin birth, etc., and rejection of the idea of hell. These are all biblical doctrines, and because, again, of liberalism and liberal theology, they were being denied, and Spurgeon is saying, well, you can't affirm Christianity and yet continue to deny those things. That was basically the downgrade. The four particular issues were, again, the denial of the infallibility of Scripture, the denial of the substitutionary nature of Christ's atonement, the denial of the existence of the eternality of hell, and the affirmation of universalism. All of these were the result of the fact that liberal theology was infiltrating the church. Spurgeon's stand in the downgrade controversy was simply put. It was about defending the matters of Christian orthodoxy. So Spurgeon highlighted the fact that, again, this liberal theology had made its way into the church, and he was sort of standing against it, and yet he really wasn't able to stop the downgrade, and he actually left the Baptist Union in 1887. The other evangelical reaction to liberal theology came from the theologians of Old Princeton Seminary. Princeton is the name of the seminary because it was located in Princeton, New Jersey. Again, this had a very a long history that we can't get into. It was just, first of all, developed as a small school in order to train ministers. It actually then grew after that and had a very important position through the time of the Revolutionary War, all the way up through, again, the early years of the 18th century. And so the point is that they became Princeton Seminary in 1812, and it trained more than 6,000 ministers in its first 100 years, giving shape to the confessional identity of American Presbyterianism. Among the titans of the faculty, four stand out: Archibald Alexander, Charles Hodge, A.A. Hodge, who is the son of Charles Hodge, and the A.A. of A.A. Hodge is Archibald Alexander, because Hodge named his son after his theology professor. And so we have first and second Hodges there, and then Benjamin B. Warfield. And there were many others, of course, but these were the most influential in establishing what one author calls the majestic testimony of the seminary from its founding until 1929, and we'll see why that's the end date. The conservative reaction in North America against modernism, or what we've been calling liberal theology and Christian teaching, had its roots in the 19th century Princeton theology, formulated at Princeton Seminary, again by Archibald Alexander, Charles Hodge, and others, in an attempt to provide a strong Calvinist bulwark against encroaching liberalism in the Presbyterian Church. It was sustained by the work of Alexander Hodge, or Archibald Alexander Hodge, A.A. Hodge, B.B. Warfield, as we've seen, and later on we're going to see J. Gresham Machen. It established biblical inerrancy as the form of verbal inspiration, as its primary tenet. So Princeton theologians recognized that the attacks of liberalism and liberal theology were basically on the Bible, and that if the inspiration and inerrancy and authority of the Bible were maintained, then the effects of liberal theology could be countered. We just choose two of the greats of these four men to really look at in detail here. Again, it would take way too much time. We could actually do a lecture on each of these. We could actually do a whole class just on Princeton theology. It's been done. But the last of these great conservative theologians who defended Calvinistic orthodoxy from the chair of theology at Princeton Seminary was Benjamin Breckinridge Warfield. He succeeded Archibald Alexander Hodge as the professor of didactic and polemic theology at Princeton in 1887, and was widely known for his scholarship. He never wrote a systematic theology, but he wrote up to at least 10 or 12 volumes of theology on theological topics that were published in a variety of things, the Presbyterian Review and several journals and that sort of thing. And his writings are still read with profit today. I read them still with profit today. Like his Princeton predecessors that we've already indicated, he was a Calvinist. He wrote numerous articles on Calvin, Augustinian theology, Westminster Confession to illuminate theological history, and most of all to advocate the positions that were illuminated there. So he was actually bringing all of those historical positions up to date in order to answer liberal theology. Warfield set his Calvinism against the tides of liberalism, which he faulted for subverting God's activity in salvation and divine authority in revelation. He was heartened by the spiritual zeal of the fundamentalists who came a little bit later, and we'll talk about them, but felt that they were forfeiting rich theological resources by drifting toward anti-intellectualism, and that will come up again later as well. He was especially antagonistic toward the defenders of revelational religious experience, and you can see that that's Schleiermacher he's got in his sights there. Whether the rationalistic piety of Albert Ritschl, as we've already said, or A.C. McGiffert, who was a theologian that had a slightly different take on the essence of religion, and but was more Arminian, but still adopted the same kind of idea that it's all about experience, and was the founder and originator, or one of the main movers in what came to be known as the higher life movement, or the Keswick movement. He also was one who stood up against the insistence on special spiritual gifts in modern Pentecostalism and wrote a couple of different treatises on that. To him, all of this substituted, and we've seen this word before, subjective religiosity for the completeness of Scripture. So essentially, this is what it comes down to. All of these, whatever the various versions of liberal theology, whatever they might be, on a very sort of, German sort of experientialism with Schleiermacher, or ethics with Ritschl, or the kinds of personal piety of the spiritual higher life movements, or even Pentecostalism, very sort of individual personal sort of things. All of these were subjective. They were all centered in one's personal experience that had a detrimental effect to both the belief in and living according to the guidance of the authority of Scripture. Warfield is best known today for his painstakingly careful efforts to defend the inerrancy of the Bible. In 1881, with A.A. Hodge, he wrote a famous essay titled Inspiration, which carefully set out the stated reassertion of traditional Protestant belief in the full infallibility and truthfulness of the Bible. He didn't use the word inerrancy, but basically that was the idea. In countless essays and reviews thereafter, Warfield labored to clarify the Bible's own testimony to its inspiration and to oppose those who detracted from Scripture's infallible authority. The last of the great theologians at Old Princeton was J. Gresham Machen. You can see he comes at the end of the 19th century and lived into the 20th century. The leading theological light for fundamentalists, and we'll get to them in the next lecture, is in the first third of the 20th century was Gresham Machen. Princeton graduate, professor of New Testament. He'd actually studied in Germany, so he had firsthand knowledge of the German liberal theology that was being taught there. So he had a thorough knowledge of his opponents, was a scholar of repute, both among friends and foes alike. His 1930 and 1923 book, Christianity and Liberalism, which in you're reading a part of that, he declared that liberal theology was a religion completely divorced from Orthodox Christianity, and those who espoused it should have the integrity not to masquerade as Christians. And by the way, he not only has those immediate liberals in his sights of his own day, but actually he's going back to Schleiermacher, basically saying that's not what Christianity is about, and you should stop calling yourself a Christian. As a result of his fulminations against modernism, again, you could read, whenever you read modernism, think liberalism or liberal theology. Machen was forced out of his denomination and his seminary position in 1929, without any opportunity to defend himself, by the way. So he was the last of the old Princeton people, and he went on from there, however, didn't stop. After World War II, the theological atmosphere in the Northern Presbyterian Church and at Princeton Seminary was changing from traditional Calvinism to the more liberal or modernist interpretation of Christianity. In the intense struggles between fundamentalists and modernists in the 1920s and 30s, Machen emerged as the international champion of biblical authority and evangelical theology. The faculty of Princeton Seminary split over these issues, and ultimately the liberal forces of the Presbyterian Church reorganized Princeton Seminary in 1929 in such a way that their viewpoint prevailed administratively. This led to the resignation of Machen, Cornelius Van Til, O.T. Alice, R.D. Wilson, and others who, under the guidance of Machen, founded Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia in 1929. A theologian of note that came later, John Murray, joined the faculty of Westminster Theological Seminary at a later date. But this became the faculty that stood as the sort of, we would say, intellectual bulwark against modernism or liberal theology, and was backed up by a number of others who came in their wake to continue that particular point of view. Well, we're going to move to some what I call delayed reactions to liberalism in the next lecture, and we'll be picking up on some of those terms that we've introduced here, fundamentalism and others. And we will see you in the next lecture then.